Hi, dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Naso. I hope you had a beautiful Shavuot. In Parshat Naso, the Torah teaches us that the Nesiim, the tribal heads, brought sacrificial animals to dedicate the altar. According to our sages, this took place on the 1st of Nisan in the year after we left Egypt. But this was not the only offering that the Nesiim presented. In advance of their consecration animals, they brought 6 wagons, what the Torah describes as sheish eglot sav, covered with decoration, and 12 large oxen with which to draw all the gifts that they were dedicating to the temple. Why is it necessary for us to learn about the wagons that they brought bearing the gifts? If the objective was simply to transport the respective gifts for the altar's dedication, why do I need to know how these gifts were transported? When relating how I received a gift from Amazon, do I need to detail that it was delivered by a guy with a foreign accent who dropped it at my doorstep and that the package was in a corrugated box? There's something else suspicious about these oxen-drawn wagons. After describing them, Hashem tells Moshe, Kach me'itam, accept these wagons from the tribal princes. V'hayu la'avod et avodat ohel moed. They will be used in the future in the service of the Mishkan. After Hashem instructed Moshe to accept the wagons, the Torah then describes how out of the 6 wagons, Moshe gave 2 to the Gershon family of Levi. Their job was to transport the curtains of the Mishkan. Now that they had these 2 wagons, they could use them to transport the curtains whenever it was time to travel in the desert. Moshe gave 4 out of those 6 wagons to the Merari family of Levi. Their job was to transport the much heavier beams of the Mishkan, which is why they needed twice as many wagons as Gershon. No wagons were given to the Kahat family of Levi, however, because their job was to transport the Aron Kodesh, the Holy Ark, and other sanctified utensils. Those could only be transported by hand due to their holiness and not on oxen-drawn wagons. Now, all this is very strange. Nowhere else do we find Hashem instructing Moshe with a plan as to how to transport the Mishkan until this very point in the Torah. All we know is that when the Mishkan was dismantled, it was to be transported by the respective Levite families. But how to transport it, whether by hand or by transport vehicle, is not at all mentioned until the Nesiim decided to donate these wagons. It almost seems like Hashem was waiting for someone to come up with the brilliant idea on their own of schlepping heavy cargo on wagons. So what's going on? The Or HaChaim suggests that Moshe made a careful calculus. Because of the intrinsic holiness of the entire Mishkan, including its curtains and beams, it would only be fitting to have people carry all the components by hand and not to consign them to be schlepped by mere animals. It was only after the Nesiim came forward that Hashem told Moshe, Kach me'itam, accept the wagons from the Nesiim, since they are correct in their thinking that this is the better method of transport. Why did it take the Nesiim to come up with this conclusion? Why couldn't Moshe himself realize that this made sense? Last week in our Devar Torah for Bamidbar, we discussed these Nesiim, who in last week's Parsha were designated by Hashem to take the census of the Jewish people. The reason why Hashem chose them was because they were the original Shoterim, the righteous Jewish taskmasters in Egypt, who took a whipping for their brethren when they fell short in their brick quota, as is recorded at the end of Exodus chapter 5. Hashem chose these men to be the Nesiim, not just as a reward to them for their valor in Egypt. What these men displayed was a compassion for their brethren, to the point where they were willing to receive harsh punishment in order to spare their brethren the pain of the whip. A parent will do anything to spare their child pain, and that is precisely how these men viewed their task. This is the most important trait for a leader. Whether it be for a corporation, a congregation, or a family, the leader needs to care about each and every member of the collective. Only when the individual feels that he is truly cared for by his leader will he work diligently and devote himself to the greater good of the collective. It was precisely because of this leadership trait that Hashem chose these Nesiim. Before installing them with their very first public role, Hashem wanted them to display this trait once again in front of everyone, demonstrating why they had been chosen. Hashem waited for the Nesiim to realize on their own that it would be a hardship to have to schlep heavy wooden beams by hand through the desert. Moshe, being the devoted servant of Hashem, was more concerned about honoring God by carrying everything by hand, even if it meant extra labor for the Levites. But the Nesiim remembered the pain of their brethren, and they decided that this was not the compassionate way. Hashem happily assented to their idea. Accept them, God said. I'm reflecting upon the recent retrieval of 4 hostages, Baruch Hashem, that we learned about last Shabbat morning. The leader of the special forces who performed the bold rescue was Arnon Zamora, Hashem Yikom Damav, who was the leader of the operation and tragically the only casualty. In reading about his eulogy at the funeral, I'm struck by 2 different depictions of Arnon, one by his fellow fighters and the other by his wife. His fellow officer said, and I quote, "He was always first, and during the heroic operation he led, he acted with courage and was a model for his fighters." But his wife Michal countered, "I asked to speak last, because the commanders were talking about how much of a hero you are. Now everyone knows about your heroism," she said. "More than anything, though, you were a sweet man, full of laughter, sensitivity, and compassion. You have been my spouse for the last 12 years. For the last 8 years, you have also been the perfect father." It's important that these things be said last, after the stories of heroism. That's what will resonate from you. And you know there's no contradiction. A leader must be brave, courageous, and enter the battlefield first. But his willingness to sacrifice himself for others is due to his strong commitment to his loved ones, his family, and his people. Like the Nesiim, Arnon had great compassion for his people, including his fellow soldiers, which is why he bravely went first in every operation. Dear friends, may Arnon's memory be a blessing and an inspiration for all of us, and may we see a complete redemption and peace in our land and a return of our hostages. Bimheira b'yameinu amen. Here's wishing you a Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos, everyone.